Hello there. This talk is called What Does It Mean to Make Open Data Accessible? Before we get on to that, quick introduction. Hi, my name is Kevin. You're welcome to grab me later and ask me questions. By day, I run developer relations at a company called Directus. We are an open data platform that aims to make data more accessible both throughout your own organization and externally as well. We do that by connecting to your existing databases and then immediately providing developer APIs and a web application to help non-developers and developers, anyone really, interact with and analyze that data. We'll talk more about this in a bit. By night, I run You Got This, which is a learning hub for core skills education, not just for developers, but core skills are really important and none of us ever get taught them. We just kind of muddle along in life until we work them out. So that is the aim of this project. And at the weekend, I run this thing called Hack Labs, where we run hackathons by curating a group of developers, designers, and researchers to answer client challenges. Now, this talk, I feel, is very much going back to basics, talking about when it is time to publish data, what artifacts might you create, what practices might you, and rituals might you implement to make that data as useful as possible. And just to note that I am a technical person, I'm a developer, and I will be approaching this from a technical perspective. This is not a talk around politics or policy. I think there are lots of fantastic talks at this event about that, just so you know where I'm coming from and what to expect. And earlier on in this stream, there was a talk about best practices around open data, and there was this 11-step. This is totally a photo. There were 11 steps kind of outlined, and mine is right here at the bottom. This is where my talk sits, right here around publishing data and seeking use cases and feedback. So, the first thing you need to understand are what are your actual motivations for publishing data? I mean, you may well just have a mandate to publish some data, but I'd like to think the people in this room and watching this talk have motivations beyond just this. It could be a desire to be more transparent, reduce corruption, engage with community members, encourage remixing and reuse, and gather feedback on that data. While researching for this talk, I became quite familiar with this acronym, the FAIR principles, which stands for findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse. And I think that these are 4 fantastic motivators for publishing data. I just want those in your mind during this talk. So firstly, chances are you are not just gathering data for the sake of gathering data. You're likely gathering it for some purpose. The purpose is quite possibly generating reports. You know, that's quite a common activity you do with data. So at the very, very lowest bar, you can publish the PDF report, call it a day. Thanks very much. I've been Kevin. I'll see you over drinks. I'm getting the thumbs down from Terence over there. And, you know, PDFs actually do have some excellent qualities around consistent rendering. They are single files. They allow for executive summaries of data, but they leave a lot of gaps when it comes to extracting and working with data. Also, being more editorial, reports also include any biases around not only how you interpret data, but what data you find interesting in any given data set. So something to bear in mind. PDFs are great when this is your stakeholder list, but this is rarely the entire stakeholder list. And we're gathered here at State of OpenCon because we have a desire to do better than this. As a note, PDFs also lack accessibility for those who use screen readers, who need to use keyboard navigation. There are ways to do it right, but often they're not. So also do bear in mind the lack of accessibility around this data format as well. So, you know, as I said, you're gathering data, quite likely to build some kind of reporting system, but there is some base data there. So the next step up from this is just take that raw data and do the work you need to you know, anonymize it, aggregate it perhaps where appropriate, and publish it, pop it into the world. And this is at least some step forward. As long as it is in a common structured format like a CSV, an open data format, i.e. not Excel spreadsheets necessarily, then this is fantastic. You know, this is some positive step forward, better than just publishing a PDF report. And there are several repositories of data that will welcome your artifacts, as I will refer to them, with open arms. But a new stakeholder appears, and that stakeholder is someone who really doesn't understand what the heck this big CSV means. And in fact, there is a real story around this. I've run a ton of government hackathons, and at one hackathon, I think it was with the once was BIS, Department for Business Innovation and Skills. We had a CSV that hackers were trying to work with to build a project, and there were a whole bunch of column headers, and no one knew what they meant. Not even the people who worked for BIS knew what they meant. Over time, the accompanying document, which Gavin calls metadata, and I also call metadata in this talk, just stopped being published, and maybe I think the data moved home and that document just ceased being published, and we just couldn't work out what it meant at all, rendering almost this entire data set completely useless. We had no idea what it meant, and to learn what it meant took a lot of time. We did eventually find out, but it sunk a lot of time, and not everyone's motivated or able to do that exploration. And so if you're not publishing metadata along with your data, your open data is actually only open to those who understand it. Your stakeholder list can only be your team, your org, the people who understand what these acronyms, these keys actually mean. So it's absolutely imperative that when you publish data, you are also publishing useful metadata. What does useful metadata mean? Not only, and actually I added a note here, so I will call it out. During Gavin's talk, I wrote here, with tools like OpenNet Zero, by publishing standardized metadata, you allow an increase in discoverability for your data, because now we can actually tell what's held within it. It might not be that that data is published free of charge, but you at least know what to expect. Not only this, though, using standard terms, units even, data types, means that several pieces of data that exist disparately across departments, agencies, organizations suddenly have some contextual value alongside each other. I'm actually very happy I went after you, Gavin. Bricking it, to be honest. Your talk was absolutely amazing. I was like, how do I follow that? But some of the points you raise, I also raise, and hopefully is some key points that you take away today. Also, with your data, publishing a license. This is a critical part of metadata to explain what people can use your data for and how, if at all, they can redistribute it. So depending on your motivations, goals, a well-structured, data set, a CSV with some metadata might be totally sufficient. But if one of your motivations is to encourage remixing and reuse by software developers, a CSV is very rarely the final form for the data. Data as published may then by developers be ingested into a database or converted into another format to have standardized queries run against them in something like SQL. This is where we're going to get a bit more nerdy in the talk. And so what you then may choose to do is publish open APIs to aid developers' journey in utilizing your data. Once again, actually, a terminology, shared data, as I learned today in Gavin's talk, open APIs doesn't necessarily mean open and free to access. It means or rather, it doesn't mean that it is free of charge to access, but that people have access to it. So what are APIs? For those of you who don't know, I think this might be useful. So developers quite often, when starting to work with data, one of the very first search queries they will make in a search engine is insert what I'm trying to learn, API. An API is a set of instructions that describe how developers can interact with data using code. They are often applications that sit on a web server somewhere with some database with data in it, and then developers can run queries against the database using the API. For example, I love that you used the trees example earlier. From a big list of trees in Greater London, show me just those from the Borough of Greenwich, or from that list, show me those that were planted after 2000, or combine those queries, for example. So they allow developers a way to start to interrogate and work with that data programmatically. APIs aren't necessarily all just read-only, accessing existing data, but they may also allow members of the public to insert data into databases as a form of citizen reporting or through community initiatives. There are several kinds of APIs that exist, but they all return, they almost all return a data format called JSON, J-S-O-N. And like CSVs, JSON is a structured data format. Unlike CSVs, they can have nested data, so a little more organization around how that data is stored and represented. So on top of publishing your PDF report, as well as publishing your CSV file, as well as publishing useful metadata that describes not only the data that exists in that data set, ideally also using standardized terms and units and a license, you may also choose to go ahead and publish developer APIs to lower the barrier to entry for remixing and reuse of that data. And this, once upon a time, was quite a feat. It took ages to go ahead and take just this CSV and do something with it, and provide an API with it. But you can now, in 2023, do it in like 5 minutes. So my day job's working at Directus, and I'm going to take 2 minutes and contextually explain what it is here. I can feel your eyes rolling into the back of your head as you're like, oh my God, he's going to pitch me for 2 minutes here. I promise it's not that. Directus is a free and open source project that aims to make data accessible in your organization for developers and non-developers alike. It connects to an existing database, as I said. It spits out developer APIs and provides like a web application to work with that data for those who aren't developers or developers also. There's a bunch of extra stuff, granular roles and permissions, automations, insights, dashboards, but that's beyond the point of this talk. We make money when people entrust us with the hosting of that service or for professional services or a few of the extra features that are just in the hosted thing. But what is free and open source, you can deploy on your own servers, you can deploy on your own machine, and you can connect to your own databases without our hands in that mix at all. And what I'm going to show you is the same irrespective of whether you host it or we host it. First thing you do is you set up what we would call a data model. And in the context of taking a CSV and trying to publish it, that just looks like creating a bunch of fields with the same column headers as your CSV. You specify the type. Is this a number? Is this a text? Is it a string? Is it a date? Is it a point in, a latitude, longitude point in the real world, and several other data formats. So you set up this data model, and then you just go ahead and upload the CSV, and you give it a moment. It's taken maybe up to like a minute or so. I fed it a pretty large data set, took a couple of minutes, and then boom, straight away developer APIs. So what we create is what is known as a REST API and a GraphQL API with that data that is provided. And you can do cool things like show me all the trees, because we know where the trees are. Show me just elm trees, or show me trees with a contract area of highways. This is using a real data set. So these are actual example queries that I ran to just test it worked. Can you show me the trees that remove the most pollution annually? Show me the top 10, or start to combine all of these filters together. Show me the trees that have the most value, like capital value as an amenity tree. Show me only those that are worth like 10 grand or more. Some trees add a lot of value to properties. I learned that looking at this data set. Holy heck, like so much money for a tree. I mean, great, but like I did not expect that. And then out of everything that's worth like 10 grand or more, show me the top 10 pollution removers. It's just an example of what you can start to do. And instead of having to traipse through this data in a tool like Excel or equivalent, you can do so as a developer with code, which then means you can go ahead and start building upon it. Add in roles and permissions, and you can start to explore this idea of shared data with various licensing models. Some data is freely available to all at no cost, no authentication required. Or perhaps you do. Some data, though, is only available if you have a certain property on your user account, and so on and so forth. So tools like this also enable you to start perhaps generating revenue off of your data, though that's something we don't do in the Directors platform itself, but you can integrate that with other platforms that handle like payments and subscriptions, and then keep your users up to date. Now, I also want to talk a little bit, as someone who works in developer relations, around some developer experience metrics that we often talk about that might be useful, might not be useful, but I wanted to raise them anyway. This is one of the key tenets of developer experience when you are building developer products. And I've gone ahead and added a bunch of alternate terms because I think this is applicable not just to developers. For developers, one of our key metrics is time to first API call. From someone signing up for the first time to them using your service successfully for the first time, what is that length of time? And you want to keep that as short as possible. And I think this is applicable not just in the world of developers, time to first query, time to first insight, whatever your motivation is, this is a really good way of validating the changes you're making to data structures, or as you're thinking about a structure of data before publishing it for the first time, making choices against this metric. Explaining how an API can be used and what it returns is critical. We spoke about metadata in terms of static data files. Exactly the same goes for APIs. Developers need to know, what are all of these queries like? I showed you some examples there. Filter 10, value greater than 10,000. How do you know that you can provide these options? We provide also what is known as API reference or documentation. We being the builders of developer tools, is a standard thing. Also make sure you're doing this with developer APIs. Directors will soon generate these for you, but even if you're publishing your own APIs, this is absolutely critical. And then finally, before I'm done with the shameless plug, is keeping different access methods in sync is critical. If you have a few ways of accessing data, you have a CSV over here, you have a REST API and a GraphQL API and some kind of visual tool to work with that data. One of the biggest sins you can commit is that the data doesn't look the same in all of these places. If people can't trust your data, they're not going to trust you. So just as we're wrapping up, wow, 17 minutes, or you've listened to me for 17 minutes, congratulations, we're almost done now. So you've given developers, both internal and external, the power to wield your data and create new projects on top of it. This apparently, I'm not really a Pokemon fan, I don't know why I went with this vibe. Apparently this is the most powerful Pokemon, just because I didn't know that, now you do too. And you or others may then choose to build exploration tools on top of those APIs, to allow people to interrogate that data and gain their own insights and infer their own meaning from that data. And this is generally done in one of two ways, these tools that are built on top of data. Either through some form of curated insights, generally a little more editorial storytelling tools. They may only highlight specific data or visualize key findings, or full-on data explorers, which are less opinionated, often have a higher barrier to entry, but let people understand the data themselves. And just as we're wrapping up, I really do just want to stress, when you're building these exploration tools, whether it is a more editorial, curated style tool or it is a full-on data explorer, they must be accessible to the users who are using them. What do I mean by accessible? There are two main things I want you to consider. Firstly, you likely do your 40 hours of work a week on something that looks like this, or on a big desktop monitor. Most users who interrogate data may well be doing so from their phones. So you want to be thinking about that experience. And in the more simple, in the more kind of common usage of the word accessible, for those with disabilities. And nothing will ever beat bringing in users with disabilities and doing user testing with them as an integral part of your development process from the very beginning, not as a footnote, not as an afterthought, and ideally you are doing this, there is no absence of this, but not in absence of this, irrespective, some things you can be thinking about: watching color contrast, screen readers, keyboard, put your teeth in, Kevin, keyboard navigability. I chose that word, navigability. These are good starting points. You should be doing these anyway. And then when testers are coming in, they can help you find more specific issues that you may not be aware of. So in summary, There are several artifacts you may publish with your data in order to make it as useful as possible. Any reports that are generated off the back of that data might actually be useful for helping people understand the kind of insights that are being drawn out from it, and perhaps also validate whether those executive summaries are actually a fair representation of the data that's being published. The data itself, I've said CSV here, but really that is any structured open data format, quite often CSV, not always, with standardized metadata. That includes things like field descriptions, terms that you use. If I call something one thing and that agency calls it another thing, it's not necessarily inherently clear that these are the same, this refers to the same thing. APIs for easier reuse and contributions, and accessible data explorers. Now, I've gone 30 seconds over, so really quickly, later on in the year, me and a couple of my friends and co-conspirators, Nat and Julia Higginbottom, are going to run this event called National Hack the Government. This might have brought out some distant memory in your mind if you've heard of this event before. Last time it was run was in 2015. We're going to run it later in the year with the aim to bring together developers and other technically curious people to increase transparency in government through open data. So that's my time. Hopefully you found that useful. I would love to chat more out there. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you very much. I must have spectacularly mismanaged this timeline, because we have actually got 5 minutes before the changeover. So if you
could have talked less quickly.
You could have added more content, but if you've got the time to stay with us for another 4.5, 5 minutes, if anybody has any questions.
The easy ones, please.
Yes, just easy questions at this time of day.
Sorry, not an easy one. I wanted to ask a bit about APIs and their accessibility. As someone who reuses open data, quite often one of the things I need to do actually is have all of it. So have an entire data set, whereas putting an API in front of it means I get one record at a time and I have to download it all. Do you think there are any transmission formats or ways to make bulk data accessible that don't require APIs that might better suit that case?
Let me think on that and come and find me later. However, few notes. I am not suggesting publishing APIs is it. I think it is something you do on top of publishing all of it. But also there are ways to in a single query, get tons of, not one at a time, 100, 1,000 at a time, but even then that could pale in comparison to the size of an overall data set. You can do this with an API and have developers kind of go over pages and pages and pages and grab that data themselves. But really, if that is something that you are expecting your users to do, publish all of it too. I'm not suggesting these are things you do. I'm not suggesting these are mutually exclusive options. In fact, exactly the opposite. It's that these build on top of each other, from publishing the PDF report right through to publishing APIs.
Any other questions?
Yeah, really interesting talk. So I understand how REST APIs work, but if I'm publishing a GraphQL API, do I need to have my data stored in a specific way, or does the database need to be formatted in a certain way, or? No,
the underlying data storage remains the same. The way you can think about this is you have your database or data store over here, you have an application built upon that data here, and in the middle you have this glue that needs to be built. You can build that in any number of ways. The data still sits over here and the applications still sit over here. The application will talk to each of these kind of options in a different way, but the data is underlying is the same. So this glue can be built to output a REST API. This glue can be built to provide a GraphQL API. REST API has long been the standard. GraphQL it's not new, it's fairly mature, but it's newer. You can only do one under a REST API. Directors generates both of them and keeps them in sync. But if you're building one from scratch, REST API is like, I think that's what many developers expect.